History books often focus on the men behind the atrocities, but the shadows were shared by the women who stood right beside them. When the Third Reich collapsed, the elite wives of the Nazi regime found their world of stolen luxury incinerated overnight. But what happened when the mansions were seized, their husbands were executed, and the world finally looked them in the eye? Were they merely naive housewives trapped in a patriarchal system? Or were they the silent, willing architects of a genocidal state? The truth is far darker, more complicated, and infinitely more disturbing than the history books suggest. The burden of guilt by association. Imagine for a moment the absolute zenith of European power. It is 1938, and the birth of Etta Goering is being celebrated not with a simple announcement, but with the roar of 500 Luftwaffe aircraft filling the sky above Berlin. Her mother, Emmy Goering, stands at the center of this spectacle, styling herself as the First Lady of the Third Reich. She possesses multiple castles, access to the most exquisite stolen art in Europe, and a social status that demands booing and scraping from the continent's elite. Now, jump forward just 7 years to the spring of 1945. The dream is shattered. The palaces are gone, the influence is vaporized, and Emmy is hiding in a 2-room forest cottage, shivering without electricity or running water, owning nothing but the 2 dresses on her back. This was the violent, overnight descent experienced by the women who once stood at the right hand of the world's most monstrous regime. When the Third Reich collapsed in May 1945, the Allied forces did not simply accept the surrender of the military. They initiated a campaign to dismantle the collective psyche of the German people. They understood that the complicity of the elite reached far beyond the battlefield. To bridge the gap between abstract horror and personal accountability, Allied commanders implemented the policy of forced tours. They marched local civilians directly into the heart of the liberated concentration camps, forcing them to look at what their husbands' orders had wrought. In Weimar, over 1,000 residents were compelled to walk through the gates of Buchenwald. They were forced to file past mass graves and stacks of decomposing corpses. They were shown the lampshades made of human skin and the piles of gold teeth pulled from the mouths of the murdered. This was not a lecture. It was a confrontation with reality that left no room for denial. The psychological fallout was immediate and sometimes lethal. At the Ohrdruf subcamp on April 7, 1945, the town mayor, Albert Schneider, and his wife were forced to witness the emaciated remains of prisoners. The vision of that degradation was enough to break them. They returned home, overwhelmed by the crushing weight of what they had finally been forced to see, and committed suicide that very night. In their final moments, they left behind a note that captures the haunting reality of the era. We did not know, but we knew. This realization, the intersection of willful ignorance and subconscious complicity, became the central pillar of post-war reckoning. As the Allies combed through the wreckage of the Nazi leadership, they turned their attention to the spouses. Women like Emmy Goering, Margaret Himmler, Ilse Hess, and Anna Ribbentrop were plucked from their private lives and thrust into the harsh confines of internment camps like Camp Ashcan and Strobing. Military interrogators were not looking for domestic companions, they were looking for accomplices. They wanted to know exactly how much these women had facilitated, benefited from, and enabled the crimes of their husbands. These women had been the primary beneficiaries of a system built on continental plunder and industrial genocide. Yet, in the aftermath, they attempted to construct a protective shield, leaning into the idea that they were merely wives in a patriarchal system that confined them to the domestic sphere. They claimed they were insulated by the very structure of the state, kept in the dark by husbands who viewed politics as a man's business. But this defense crumbles under even the lightest scrutiny. Their lifestyles were directly funded by the theft of Europe, their homes were staffed by slave labor, and their comfort was sustained by the apparatus of the concentration camps. The term brown widow began to define these women in the public consciousness. It was a label that captured the dual nature of their existence. They were the parasitic beneficiaries of a murderous state, yet they navigated a world that had legally marginalized women from executive decision-making. This created a profound gray area of responsibility. While they had no vote in the decision to invade a country or start a war, they had every advantage of the spoils that followed. They were stripped of their titles and their assets, transformed from the queens of the Reich into social pariahs. The transition was total. The same women who had clashed with Eva Braun for precedence at state functions were now sitting on wooden benches in detention centers, waiting to find out if they would be classified as major war criminals or mere followers. They were forced to watch as their luxury vanished, replaced by the crushing anonymity of the rubble years. For these women, the end of the war was not just a military defeat. It was the beginning of a lifelong struggle to reconcile their past status with their new reality as the wives of the most reviled men in human history. They were left to walk through the ruins of a nation they had helped crown, facing a future where their names were permanently etched into the history of human cruelty. Survival amidst the rubble. The winter of 1945 was a season of biblical reckoning for the wives of the Third Reich's elite. For years, these women had commanded expansive estates, surrounded by an army of domestic servants who catered to their every whim. They were the queens of a new order, insulated from the world by velvet curtains and the absolute authority of the SS. But as the Soviet Red Army surged from the east, the domestic boundaries they had built vanished in a flurry of snow and terror. Millions of German women were thrust into a desperate, chaotic westward migration. A frozen exodus where the wives of regional Nazi administrators found themselves sharing the same roads, the same starvation, and the same existential dread as the people their husbands had trampled. This was the moment the myth of their untouchable status finally died, replaced by the primitive, biting reality of survival in a collapsing world. Fear was the primary currency of those final weeks. It was not merely the loss of power that haunted them, but the looming specter of retribution. In the Obersalzberg, the site of Hitler's mountain retreat, Emmy Goering and her young daughter Edda abandoned the comforts of their life to burrow into a rustic, freezing forester's hut. They sat in the dark, listening to the roar of the advancing front line, stripped of their finery and huddled against the damp cold of the alpine spring. This was not a unique tragedy. Rudolf Höss, the man who had overseen the industrial slaughter at Auschwitz, traded his uniform for the anonymity of an agricultural laborer. He spent nearly a year working on a farm near the Danish border, desperately hoping that a life of shoveling manure would be enough to camouflage his identity from the Allied dragnet. For these people, survival meant invisibility. When the occupation finally solidified, the reality of the post-war landscape took a turn toward the grueling. The Allied forces implemented a policy of total economic annihilation. Every bank account was frozen, every property seized, and every asset scrutinized by the machinery of denazification courts. These women were not just left without wealth. They were subjected to severe, state-mandated asset stripping. In many cases, up to 30% of their remaining personal property was confiscated, leaving them with nothing but the clothes they wore. The silver, the jewelry, and the fine china that had defined their lives in the Reich were suddenly dragged to the black market. They stood in the dust of ruined marketplaces, bartering their last family heirlooms for a loaf of bread, a handful of coal, or a tin of meat. The hierarchy of the Third Reich had been replaced by the brutal economy of the bazaar. The most profound shift, however, was the loss of domestic agency. In the ruins of German cities, the Trümmerfrauen, or rubble women, became the defining image of the era. The elite wives who had once spent their days managing households of staff were forced into the streets alongside working-class women to clear millions of tons of debris by hand. There was no prestige in this work. It was a physical and social equalizer that ignored rank, title, and past associations. Under the watchful eyes of Allied soldiers, these women were forced to clear the brick and mortar of their own fallen empire. It was an exhausting, back-breaking existence that stripped away the last vestiges of their former identities. They learned to handle a shovel with the same focus they had once reserved for social standing. The psychological weight of this transition cannot be overstated. They were left to navigate a hostile, broken society in total isolation. Many of their husbands were gone, some having chosen the coward's way out with poison or a bullet in the Führer bunker, others vanishing into the secret rat lines that snaked toward South America. These wives were left behind to raise children in a country that viewed their very names as a stain on the national conscience. They carried the burden of their husbands' legacies while struggling to find enough calories to survive the next day. The comfort of the villa, the security of the regime, and the arrogance of their past status were completely erased. They had been forced to witness the humanitarian collapse their husbands' policies had set in motion, and in the end, they were left with nothing but the rubble of a world they had helped destroy. The innocent bystander defense. Could someone really ignore the smell of burning flesh drifting into their own garden? This is the central question when confronting the post-war claims of the women of the Third Reich. When the smoke cleared, these wives stepped into the courtroom and the public square armed with a singular, carefully constructed shield, the kitchen myth. They argued that because the National Socialist doctrine of Kinder, Küche, Kirche, children, kitchen, church, strictly relegated them to the domestic sphere, they were effectively insulated from the machinery of state terror. They painted themselves as innocent, maternal bystanders, shielded from the military realities of their husbands' work. But this narrative is not just a revision of history. It is a calculated lie that ignores the brutal, structural reality of how their households actually functioned. Take the case of Hedwig Höss, the wife of Auschwitz Commandant Rudolf Höss. To hear her tell it, she was merely a mother raising 5 children in a quiet, secluded home. The reality was a grotesque parody of domestic bliss. Her family resided in a 2-story villa located inside the Auschwitz camp complex, separated from the gas chambers and the crematoria by nothing more than a simple concrete garden wall. Her children played in a pristine swimming pool and chased butterflies in a manicured rose garden, all of which were maintained by the very prisoners who were being marched to their deaths just yards away. The ambient sound of gunshots, the screams of victims, and the heavy, sweet, and unmistakable stench of human ash were constant features of their daily lives. To claim she was unaware of the camp's purpose is to deny the evidence of her own senses. Her domestic life was not just built near the camp, it was fueled by the machinery of genocide. In the attic of that villa, Hedwig oversaw an elite fashion salon known as the Upper Tailoring Studio, or the Obere Nähstube. Here, Slovakian Jewish dressmaker Marta Fuchs and other enslaved women were forced to work, reconditioning the high-end clothing, furs, and jewelry stolen from victims moments before they were murdered. Hedwig's fancy dresses, which became the envy of every other SS wife in the region, were literally sewn from the spoils of the gas chambers. Yet, even in her exploitation, she maintained a toxic, performative racial prejudice, ordering that buttons be replaced on her garments because she did not want her family's skin touching anything that Jewish hands had tainted. She was not a bystander. She was an active participant in the commercialization of mass murder. The claim of ignorance is even more jarring when compared to the absolute, fanatical devotion displayed by women like Magda Goebbels. There was no pretense of innocence here. Magda was the celebrated maternal icon of the Reich, a woman deeply embedded in the inner circle of power. When the end finally arrived in the Führer bunker in May 1945, her actions revealed the true, lethal endgame of their shared ideology. Rather than allow her 6 young children to exist in a world where National Socialism had failed, she made the cold, calculated decision to poison them herself before taking her own life. This was not the act of a woman who was shielded or unaware. It was the final, fanatical expression of a belief system that prioritized the survival of the regime over the lives of her own flesh and blood. The post-war decades saw a systematic effort to erase these truths through selective amnesia. Memoirs such as the one published by Emmy Goering, titled By My Husband's Side, were carefully scrubbed of any mention of anti-Semitism, their support for Hitler, or their enrichment through plundered assets. They focused on personal inconvenience and allied cruelty, effectively rebranding themselves as victims of a system they had championed. During the Nuremberg trials and subsequent denazification hearings, these women acted as a unified front, providing rehearsed and perjured testimony to save their husbands from the gallows and to secure their remaining family fortunes. The propaganda of the Reich promised a return to traditional, austere, and modest domesticity, but the reality was a lifestyle sustained by the total economic and moral plunder of occupied Europe. While the regime touted the separation of men and women into distinct spheres, the wives of the elite were perfectly comfortable benefiting from the horrific output of the concentration camp economy. They were not naive housekeepers. They were integral components of a state that weaponized the domestic sphere to legitimize its crimes. By deconstructing the myth of their ignorance, we see that these women were not peripheral figures in the history of the Third Reich. They were the beneficiaries, the sustainers, and the willing accomplices of a project of destruction that utilized every aspect of their lives to keep the machinery running until the very last moment. Psychological impacts and generational trauma. What happens when you look in the mirror and see a monster? For the children and grandchildren of the Third Reich's architects, this was not a rhetorical question but a daily, suffocating reality. As the rubble of Germany was cleared away, a different kind of wreckage remained, the silent, toxic legacy passed down through families who lived under the shadow of mass murder. In these households, the past was treated as a radioactive void. Parents and grandparents constructed a protective wall of absolute silence, refusing to discuss the war, the Holocaust, or their own roles in the machinery of extermination. This communicative vacuum created a psychological pressure cooker, forcing the next generation to grow up in a state of perpetual, confused cognitive dissonance. They sensed the presence of a dark, unspeakable secret, yet they were strictly forbidden from bringing it into the light. This silence did more than hide the truth. It warped the identity of the descendants. Many grew up feeling that they were carrying a corrupted bloodline, a heavy, inherited stain that was permanently synonymous with the greatest crimes in human history. For some, the burden became so visceral that standard therapy or distance was not enough to provide relief. They needed to take somatic, physical action to purge the weight of their names. Bettina Göring, the grandniece of the infamous Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring, made the extraordinary decision to undergo surgical sterilization at the age of 30. She was joined by her brother in this choice, a calculated, permanent act intended to ensure that the Göring bloodline would end with their generation. This was not a casual decision. It was a desperate, physical rejection of their own genetic heritage, a way to surgically excise the history of a monster from the future of their family. For others, the struggle manifested as a lifelong game of hide and seek. The anxiety of being exposed, of having a neighbor, a colleague, or a journalist discover the truth about their lineage, dictated every facet of their adult lives. Klaus Eichmann, the son of the Holocaust architect Adolf Eichmann, lived with this fear every single day. Even when the family moved to Argentina to escape the reach of post-war justice, they were not safe from the consequences of their name. By retaining the Eichmann surname at his father's insistence, Klaus kept his family tethered to a target, eventually contributing to the series of events that led to the discovery and capture of his father by Mossad agents. The past, which they had tried so hard to bury, had a way of resurfacing, often with devastating results. The geography of their lives became a map of their trauma. Some chose to flee into self-imposed exile, seeking out the most remote corners of the planet to distance themselves from the reach of the Nazi shadow. Bettina Goering eventually found refuge in the sprawling, desolate deserts of New Mexico. In that vast, empty landscape, she could finally exist as an individual rather than a symbol of a genocidal regime. Similarly, the daughter of Auschwitz Commandant Rudolf Höss, Brigitte Höss, spent her adult years living a quiet, unassuming life in the United States, working in a Washington, D.C. fashion boutique. She lived in the shadow of her father's name, keeping her past locked away behind a carefully maintained facade of normality. These were not lives of luxury. They were lives of constant underlying tension, defined by the necessity of hiding in plain sight. The psychological scars were deep, often driving these descendants into decades of complex, emotional, and often unresolved therapy. They had to navigate the impossible task of reconciling their love for a father or grandfather with the objective, undeniable fact that he was a mass murderer. This was not a simple binary of hate or love, but a chaotic, swirling mess of grief, resentment, and moral confusion. While some, like Gudrun Burwitz, the daughter of Heinrich Himmler, chose a path of fanatical denial and continued to support neo-Nazi networks until her death in 2018, most were left in a state of paralyzing uncertainty. They were trapped in a cycle of needing to confront the truth and fearing that the truth would consume them. The trauma of the Nazi elite's families was not limited to the survivors of the concentration camps. It extended into the very homes of the perpetrators, where children grew up in the ruins of their parents' moral universe. They were the accidental custodians of a history they had no part in creating, yet they were the ones forced to pay the psychological interest on the debts of their fathers. Whether they changed their names, fled to the other side of the world, or sought to end their bloodlines entirely, they were all bound by the same grim realization that even in a world that had moved on, the legacy of the Third Reich was an inescapable shadow. They were living proof that the crimes of the elite did not stop at the executioner's door. They radiated outward, twisting the lives of the innocent descendants who were left to carry the weight of names that should have been erased from history. Notable figures and their controversial aftermath. The war ended in 1945, but for many of the women who anchored the Nazi elite, the struggle to preserve the Reich simply shifted into the shadows. They did not retreat into quiet obscurity. Instead, they became the architects of a post-war resistance that sought to shield their husbands and preserve an ideology that the rest of the world had spent years trying to dismantle. Perhaps no figure embodies this unrepentant defiance better than Gudrun Burwitz, the daughter of Heinrich Himmler. Affectionately called Puppy by her father, she spent her entire life, until her death in 2018, dedicated to the cause of cleansing his name. She was not a passive bystander. For decades, she served as a high-ranking authority within Stille Hilfe, an underground organization that provided financial, legal, and medical aid to fugitive and convicted war criminals. She acted as a lifeline for monsters like Klaus Barbie and the brutal Theresienstadt guard Anton Maloth, ensuring they could avoid the justice they so richly deserved. Even more shocking is that between 1961 and 1963, she worked under a pseudonym as a secretary at the Pullach headquarters of the West German Federal Intelligence Service, embedded in the very agency tasked with monitoring the remnants of the Nazi movement. While women like Gudrun kept the flame of ideology alive at home, others were busy helping the most wanted men in history disappear into the dark. As the Allied noose tightened, a complex network of clandestine escape routes known as the Rat Lines began to move high-ranking officials to safety. With the help of sympathetic figures in the Vatican and the logistical support of the Perón administration in Argentina, mass murderers were spirited away to South America. Adolf Eichmann, the architect of the logistical nightmare that was the final solution, managed to slip into Buenos Aires in 1950 under the alias Ricardo Clement. His wife, Vera Liebli, arrived 2 years later with their sons to complete the deception. She did not just wait for him in the shadows, she actively maintained his cover. She played the part of his sister, instructed her own children to refer to their father as Uncle Ricardo, and kept the world from realizing that one of the most significant war criminals in history was living in plain sight. They lived this lie for nearly a decade, successfully weaponizing domestic normalcy to shield a monster from the reach of the law. The massive gulf between the public facade of these women and their private reality is documented in the archives they left behind. Their own personal diaries and self-serving memoirs are the smoking gun. Margaret Himmler, who presented herself to the world as an ignorant wife, filled her private journals with vitriolic, hateful anti-Semitism that proves her worldview was perfectly aligned with the death camp network her husband directed. They utilized the myth of the naive domestic housewife to manipulate the denazification process, providing rehearsed and perjured testimony in courtrooms to secure the release of their husbands and the preservation of their family assets. These were not innocent victims of a patriarchal regime. They were calculated agents of a state that relied on their cooperation to function. The legacy of these women is a dangerous lesson in the power of revisionism. By sanitizing their pasts, they allowed the narrative of the innocent bystander to take hold, a story that has been used for generations to downplay the complicity of those who occupied the inner circles of power. Their stories dismantle the simplistic portrayal of women under fascism as passive, non-complicit observers. They demonstrate that the private, domestic sphere was not a sanctuary away from the reach of politics, but a central component of a genocidal corporate state. They managed their homes, raised their children, and entertained their guests in the same villas where the mechanisms of mass murder were planned and executed, often with full knowledge of the human cost.